I'm Master Saturn. Thank you for joining me for another BDSM United podcast. Today's podcast is somewhat unscripted, meaning that we didn't take a lot of notes for this, and it's more about some of our viewpoints and how just culture in general affects uh, what we bring to the table concerning BDSM and affects a lot of ways how we do BDSM, how we feel about BDSM, and how we communicate the things that we know about BDSM. Today's episode is called BDSM Politics. And while on our pages and resources, we usually uh, we don't ignore, but we rather um, we just don't go there. We don't tend to talk about politics. We tend to just overlook people's political ideologies for the most part, because BDSM to us is for all adults, regardless of what you believe about religion or politics. To us, for the most part, really doesn't matter. Where it matters today, though, and why we're even bringing up the topic, is because BDSM has changed some. It has, of course, adapted. It came from a certain place. There's a bit of historic revisionism happening because of political ideologies and people's political and ideological values have pressed upon BDSM certain changes, and then people's response um, have been for lack of better terminology, people's response have been colored by their own political ideologies. And so, where did we come from, and where are we now, and where are we going? Where we came from is, of course, BDSM history. S&M history has a history of 1,000 plus years. You can see evidences in ancient Egypt, for instance, and possibly other places before that. You can see evidences and hints of S&M play, sadism, masochism. Those are inherent within people in general, and so you'll see those expressions of sadism and masochism come out all throughout history. BDSM is unique to gay male a leather culture in the 1950s, as men returned from World War II, and they begin to combine S&M play with power exchange, which was based on military protocols and military hierarchy. Someone that was a captain, for instance, would be over someone who was a private, and they began to take these power imbalances into their relationships and started to have relationship structures where someone was the dominant leader, someone was the officer, for instance, and then someone was the follower. Someone was like the private, for instance. And so this power imbalance relationships began, allowing someone to exert control and force, and allowing someone to top, so to speak, and someone to bottom, so to speak. Both in kinky play, but also in the structure of their relationships. It was quite unique. And while, of course, sadism and masochism have existed for a number of years, and people have always exerted some level of dominance or submission all throughout human history, nobody really put the two together, combining it with things like leather and leather play until around the 1950s. And that's what makes BDSM, what we have today, BDSM, unique. And it is a direct descendant of that gay male leather culture that existed. And so that's where it came from. That's where we came from. And we've adapted. We're now more inclusive. First, lesbians were added around the 70s to leather culture. And then around the 80s, and of course, up until today, uh, it has been a lot of straight people are added, and transgender people have gained acceptance within leather communities. And just, now everyone, it is inclusive of everyone, regardless of your sexual orientation, regardless of your gender identity, regardless of your ethnicity, regardless of where you are located, because the internet is global. And so now there's not just BDSM in certain cities. BDSM happens all around the world by all kinds of people, people from different religious faiths, religious backgrounds, people with no religions at all. BDSM is widely inclusive and it's global, and it's seen just everywhere. We get people from all over the world that visit our resources and utilize our resources. And we've tried to make our resources for people, for that global audience. So that's where we came from. Where are we now is that we're inclusive. But BDSM has also changed maybe in the last 10 or 15 years. And then people's response to that change is shaping where we're going in the future. That's really what more of the focus of what we want to talk about as far as BDSM politics. So the culture has shifted into two major groups, two major ideologies of people. And because we're talking globally, even though I'm American by nationality, we're not talking about American politics when I use this terminology. We have these terminologies in our own politics here, but they exist in every country. There's a more liberal left and a more conservative right. And that's just in politics in general. In global politics, there's a left and there's a right. A left leans towards more liberalness and progressiveness, and a right focus leans more towards conservatism. Sorry, I'm trying to pronounce the words correctly. And when you go to the extreme on either of those sides, you get into some very extreme things like communism and socialism, which can be somewhat extreme. And then you get things like fascism on the other side, and nationalism, which can be really extreme on the other side. And people exist somewhere in this spectrum of left and right. We've tried to stay somewhat center course to the most part, and our own personal politics vary on that spectrum, just depending on the issues personally. There are things where I'm more left and things that I'm more right, or left of center and right of center, and there's things I'm more in the center of. So my own political ideologies don't really matter in my expression of this topic today. Sure, we all have biases, and I have biases. Of course, there's no way to not have a bias. To have an opinion is to have a bias, and so there's no news agency, even though they claim to try to be unbiased. There's just no way. It's an impossibility within human nature. It's also an impossibility, just the same way, to not judge. A lot of religious people will try to say you shouldn't judge, but that's impossible. We make judgments all the time. Judgments are important to BDSM, for instance, when in regards to safety, in regards to vetting, in regards to relationships, who we're gonna choose to play with. We need to make personal judgments so that we can try to stay safe. and we make personal judgments on how much risk we're willing to allow and how much we can mitigate, and so how much we're going to play and where we're going to be cautious. We make those personal judgments. Saying all of this to say that um, there has been more of a shift from the left side of center, the left side of the spectrum, to adapt BDSM and make BDSM more of like or similar to a gender identity or similar to a sexual orientation. And a lot of times they have made up new identities. They've made up new words that are not based on traditions. They something, for instance, like traditionally, a rope bottom would exist within BDSM, but not a rope bunny, and we wouldn't generally have a whole culture surrounding and a whole community surrounding rope bunnies or even really just rope bottoms. We wouldn't typically have this whole culture, but now people are taking that as a personal identity to where they're hyper focusing on one kink, for instance. And I'm just using rope bottom, rope bunny as an example. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with either of those. I'm just using that as an example. And because I have to use something as an example, I can't just use nothing. And so there is a push from left of center and more political ideology where we get more of a relativism injected into BDSM, where it is all about personal experience. There is less of a shift, or there's a shift away from local community. There is a shift away from community consensus, and there's a shift towards more of a hyper personalization of BDSM. And with this hyper personalization, they're personalizing and creating new identities, and the traditions that we had, such as master slave, dom sub, dom a, submissive, those different words, and even daddy, mommy, and little, just the set of identities that we had that were community consensus are now being stretched, molded, shifted, changed to where sometimes the words don't even mean what they used to mean. Dominant doesn't always mean dominant anymore. And so we kind of stretch to this relativism that really, the farther you go left, the more you get into the ridiculous and the absurd, where words only mean, and titles and identities only mean and only have the value that you personally place on them. They don't have any community. There's a lack of community consensus, and it's fine that people in that scheme of things on that side, on that left side, it's perfectly okay that they want to do their BDSM that way. Where we have a problem is when is in the response from right of center to the actions of left of center, where instead of putting an emphasis on community consensus, besides putting an emphasis on local community, instead of pointing people back to traditions and using BDSM traditions as the focal point, instead of that, they're leaning farther right, and they're using a sort of hyper fascism to bully the people on the left. And we've got an injection of this far right. And in the far right is where we find toxic masculinity, where we find toxic femininity or feminism, the toxic kind, not and not the just normal degrees of feminism and masculinity, but we find this hyper feminism and this hyper toxic masculinity far on that right, and that their response is to um, is to insult or to try to discredit uh, people, and they're saying that that BDSM now should be um, exclusively heterosexual, or it's okay that you do BDSM your own way, just do it privately and don't let anyone have to see it. You know what I mean? Like let us not have to know about your type of BDSM. And so there's this tension in between the left of center and the right of center. And there's these, and what we're calling for really, and is to, and we try to model this by example, is that we believe that you, uh, if you feel like BDSM is changing too much, don't use your a political ideology to try to combat that. Don't use this far left of center and far right of center should not shouldn't be the basis of BDSM, but rather we should look back to where we came from, and we should contextualize modern BDSM based on traditions. We should, when we're going to change things, we should know what the traditions are and why we changed them. We should neither of us or none of us should try to revision history or shape history to accommodate our own style or our own personal flavors of BDSM, but we should, move closer to the center where we are gracious with one another. And when we should both, all of us should look back towards traditions, and we should look at the tradition and try to shape BDSM that doesn't disrespect, doesn't radically redefine, and doesn't revision BDSM. So we should, we should be a legacy. We should be a child of this parent, and not be a rebellious child, but we should be a respectful child. We should be a legacy to all of the people that have come before us, people that had to endure a lot of hardship and a lot of scrutiny, and but really have instilled a lot of integrity and honor and loyalty and values into the relationships that we have and into the structure of power exchange, because military structure, military protocol, military hierarchy is throwing the war stuff out of the window, but just taking the protocol of how they relate one to another. Is they relate one to another with honor and loyalty and such, with a high degree of moral character. And we can be as perverted as we want to be, but together, one with another, we should have a high degree of moral character with how we do relationships one with another, how we view one another. And we should look, like I said, back to those traditions and let the traditions inform how we're going to do BDSM today and in the future and as we're going forward. So, politics does come into play, as we're seeing, as I'm wrapping this up. Politics does come into play. Ideology will inform how you do BDSM, and it has been informing more and more of BDSM. And we've seen it on our pages and resources, and in response that people, we've seen that we've attracted some really far right leaning people, and we've attracted some far left leaning people, and and we're somewhere in the center of these two camps, and we're just trying to have a peaceful, intellectual um, argument or discussion, even about what BDSM means, where it came from, and where we see it going in the future. I'm Master Saturn. Thank you for joining me for this BDSM Unite podcast, where we've talked a little bit more about philosophy and politics and ideology, more than the more than the tools and techniques of BDSM themselves. And so, thank you for following this today, and thank you for listening to this. And please feel free to leave a comment, but please keep it respectful. And tell me what you agree with, what you disagree with. Maybe tell me how you see BDSM. Tell me how you see BDSM in the past, where you see us now, and where you see BDSM going. I'm Master Saturn. Thank you for joining me. You can find all of our resources at www.bdsmunited.com, and I'll talk with you again soon.